In this video, we're going to discuss the importance of documenting the current conditions of your projects and why this is often the best place to start when developing a new scope. Again, the reminder is that this is going to go into your RFP itself. That scope of work section here at the bottom here, what we are purchasing, is also where we're going to describe this concept of current conditions. Now, high-performing scopes also will include the current conditions or the current state of what that service or what that project or what that product looks like at the state prior to competing this new RFP, which obviously is going to be for an upgrade or an enhancement or to get better or more, but we don't want to overlook what the current condition is today. So it's a description of what is today's current condition with respect to this project. Now, you can think about it kind of like going on a journey from point A to point B. Yes, there's point B where we're trying to get to, what our final destination is. That's our scope, along with all the requirements and everything else that's going to go into that scope. But we cannot overlook the starting point. Well, where are we driving from on this journey? That's the current conditions. And I'm going to have that larger here because this is what is in view for this video, the current conditions. A few things to note. The current conditions are actually one of the easiest pieces of the scope to document, which is great. But unfortunately, they're also the most often overlooked piece of the scope across most agencies and client groups. The other thing to think about is this. It is true that the current conditions or the current state environment is one of the most often requested pieces of information from the proposing community. So in other words, the good news here is that the proposers want to know this information. It's highly influential in their proposals. Secondly, it's really easy for us to document relative to trying to envision what the perfect future environment looks like. And again, we're not trying to achieve perfection in our scopes, but this current conditions is usually easier to document because it's just documenting what we do today, what we look like today, which we are experts in. That's what we know at the state. So we have to paint that picture, yes, of the scope. Unfortunately, a lot of times we spend all of our focus looking at what we want to be in the future. What is that destination point? In this case, we want to be the fancy race car. But a lot of times we can forget to describe what we look like right now. And what we look like right now might have an effect on how the proposers are going to get us from point A to point B. Do our current conditions really matter? Absolutely they do. They matter quite a bit. It allows the proposers to understand what that change looks like to go from point A to point B, what the difficulties may be, where we as a client group might be unique compared to their other clients because our current state might be a little bit different. And they can help them verify that their approach is accurate to get us from point A to point B. So it's critically important. Another example here, even for projects as simple as this is going to be a re-roofing example. So just rip and replace a roof on several buildings here for the Coast Guard. So this example that's outside the state, but quick, simple example to show that even here, you might think that roofing a project here don't need the current conditions. Not true, absolutely still needed. This is some pictures from the actual site here. The project was to rip and replace this roof, but we did pause in the RFP process and ask those proposing contractors, hey, is there anything else you would like to know about this project or about our current conditions? And they said, absolutely. What activities or uses are occurring in the building now? And what issues or concerns do we have at the moment? Well, the answers were issue number one is that the building leaks every time it rains. That's a problem because the actual building use here is that this is a recreation facility. There's a gymnasium there, basketball courts, and essentially every time it rains, we have to get out there as a client with a bucket, multiple buckets, and catch all the drips to not damage the floor underneath. So we're worried about that. And it's a big cost to have somebody monitoring these facilities every time a storm rolls through. It's really unsustainable, right? So we have these current conditions, which helped in this way. Turns out the project, yes, the project was to rip and replace this roof. That was our scope. That's what the red arrow is pointing to. Here's our scope, rip and replace this roof. But the proposals also came back saying this. The leaks in the building are not just coming from the roof. they're coming from this area as well, which you see highlighted, because there are cracks in the parapet walls. That's down here. We've got caulking that's falling apart. We've got shattered glass, and the rain is penetrating through to the courts below. So in other words, the scope should be to stop the building from leaking, not necessarily just to rip and replace a roof. And so by describing that current condition, along with the pain points that we have with the current state environment, the proposals came back better equipped to meet our overall need and accomplish the true intent of that scope. So, in short, the current conditions allow a good, solid expert proposer to better address the needs that we actually have to make us happy with the eventual outcome. So, when it comes to describing our current conditions, what should we be including in that section of the scope? Well, let's go through the top 5 things that you want to consider. So we're going to go through each of these 5, briefly describe them, and talk about why we want to include them. Number 1 is just an overview or a summary or a background of our current conditions. So describe that current state environment as it is today. As a quick example, imagine that you are completing an IT software project. Then you might want to describe whether the existing system is a manual pencil and paper process, or do we have an existing legacy system in place right now at the state? If it's a legacy system, well, what type, what specific version, what are we using now? And how long has it been in place? What's the time horizon here? Things of that nature might be helpful to describe so that the proposing firms have a better sense of what we look like today and what is our state of affairs now. Number 2, volumes and quantities. And of course, this is going to be historic information, historic data in nature. So not necessarily what we're trying to accomplish in the future, but it's context of what do we look like today. So those historic volumes could be, depending upon the project, different transactions, maybe number of users, number of different events, scopes, facilities, so on. What are the 3 to 5 key numbers that describe what we look like today? That's going to be key. Now, this should fit on the very first page with the overview and background. So it doesn't have to be long. Also back there on our summary of the current conditions with our overview and background, that itself should be less than 1 page in length because we're also going to fit our historic data on there as well. Try to get all that captured in a single page. So not a huge ask in terms of the volume of content here. Number 3 in the current conditions is your pain points. So this is a place to describe what are the challenges, the issues, the frustrations with the current state environment. In other words, what should this project be fixing once it is complete? What do we want to address? Now, give a simple list of items here. Does not have to be complex. The top 5 to 10 items are probably a good enough goal. And this is something that should fit on a single page. Its bullet points are fine. Just list them out 1 through 10 or however many you have. Similar deal for number 4 is strengths. Is there anything that you actually like about our current conditions? Are there things that we want to build upon? Are there things that we want to preserve in the future? Well, it's good to point those out here so that they don't get overlooked by the proposing vendor community. Once again, top 5 to 10 things at most is completely fine. If you have that many strengths, many times we find that agencies have a lot of shortcomings they want to address and maybe fewer strengths that they want to preserve, but don't overlook that part. If there are strengths to preserve, put them here. Once again, single page maximum is fine. Oftentimes you can fit the strengths on the same exact page as your pain points. So at that point, if you're keeping count here, sections 1 and 2 are just a page themselves, most likely. And then sections 3, 4, likely another page. So we're at 2 pages total, pretty simple. And then number 5 is other supplemental information. So most common things here to provide additional description of our current conditions, most commonly will be figures or diagrams or workflows or other reference materials, previous reports, things of that nature. As a quick example for, again, IT software, you might have information like an architecture diagram, dashboards and forms. You can see in this case, we have an existing Excel-based form that we're going to get upgraded into our first ever software system. We could describe current use cases, describe current workflows, and so forth, right? So this is a good spot to put those towards the appendix of the RFP. Don't bog down the scope of work with all of that reference materials. Make an appendix, an attachment, a schedule, an exhibit, whatever terminology is needed, in reference to that from your current conditions section. So in summary, that high-performing scope goes in combination with our current conditions. You almost cannot have a high-performing scope without also documenting those current conditions. We covered these 5 items of the current conditions in this video. Our next video is going to cover the 5 key areas of the scope itself.